Kitty's Windmill by Kārlis Skalbe. A grey old man in a bare fur coat came out of the frosted garden and looked back through the apple trees, to which a slight shiver of ice shuddered over the evening's blush, like its pale ash films over glowing coal. Thick redness fell on his face. It was a furious old man's face. His mustache and beard looked like long silver fringes, frozen in blue and green ice acorns, to which the evening put on a little red. It was the old Lauskis, the evicted father of the master, who had given home to his son too soon. He wandered only on a big frost, when all the branches were laid in fine ice, and the red sunset, like a reflection of anger under the apple trees and along the corners of the buildings, sought out of his red face. Look, the old man jumps, so that frosty clump of hair on the back of his head breaks, and kicks with an axe at the bottom of the barn. Oh, oh! The log screams, and his heart breaks. It is broken. It breaks moaning mournfully like a string of a harp, and the kitten stops on the walkway that walks from room to the barn, and listens to his foot raised. Oh, the old master's father is kicking again, the kitten says, after spotting Lowski leaving, furiously looking back with an axe over his shoulder, and the apple trees stood like they are scared, not a branch did not breathe. Should go to the granary, thought the kitten. The mistress is scolding the kitten. Kitten, what are you waiting for? Should have looked at what the mice are doing in the granary. Should go out of shame, thought the kitten. He raises one leg, freezing, raises the other, freezing. Men coming home from the forest unharnessed the horses and happily clapped their big hands. Are you going to catch mice? What are you meddling here? The kitten jumped from the log and sat down in the snow. Go and catch mice when you have nor mittens nor socks. And he quietly sneaked up behind the squeaky pastels of the workers. When the doors were closing after the last frosted boot, he softly and quietly, like a woolen yarn, went over the doorstep into the room. And while the big swollen legs of the workers were standing in front of the door, the kitten was already on the oven couch. Tell me, what do those legs help you? Red grain of salt, which had been left over from the autumn meat salting and was laying on the oven couch, said, How long has it been since you ran out, and now you are back rubbing your sides against me? See how all I need is in my head, because I am ground salt. And what is wrong with rags behind the oven? Said the rags, which were drying on the rope. Working all day, and when the table and dishes are scrubbed, just sit in the warmth behind the oven till the morning. God forbid, if a tramp twists you around his leg and drags you about the world in this weather. During the winter I like to close my eyes, the white cattle hissed, and blew steam through its nose. To close eyes and dream, I see earth where the tea tree is blossoming, and blue kilt of a king where golden dragons are twisting. I see summer wind blowing them around. The king is walking through a garden to his alabaster pergola. There 12 queens, with 12 yellow dreamy eyes, are waiting for him. They are drinking tea from small porcelain cups, on which little queens with gold brown eyes, which see only tails, are painted. Then the king calls his storyteller and commands him to tell stories about heroes and dragons, and when the dragon with 12 heads backs the hero into the ground, the 12 queens bow their 12 heads in their palms and tremble, while the hero has not cut the 12 heads of the dragon. I could tell many stories, but they are all from China. Kitten, tell some stories. The kitten went into a hunch, laid on his cold feet, closed his eyes, and started thinking. Kitten, kitten, tell a story, said little Dāvis, putting his cheek against the back of the kitten's trembling head, and when Dāvis had sat next to him, the kitten began. Back in the good old times, when the good times were, one kitten had a mill. They worked day and night. Mrr, mrr, mrr. There were nut and almond mills. That was back in the good old days, when those days were. Hops and the side of the mill were covered with flour dust. Their tendrils were always trembling from the roaring of the mill. Grain looked through the window if the workers were not coming. The miller himself, in a white coat, was walking and counting sacks of almonds and sacks of nuts. In the evening, through all the windows shined a golden fire. The mill was roaring, the water was playing the pipe, and the daughters of the kitten were dancing with the new neighbors. They had long golden eyes, and their nails were hidden in their pink paws. The most cheerful it was during Christmas. Then in the white mill there was a green Christmas tree with golden nuts and glowing candles, and the dwarfs were sitting in the corner next to the gathered sacks of flour, silently holding their white pipes in their callous hands, shaking their head and saying, "Yes, this is something." And when the conifer lit up, a blue smoke bubble lightly rose and flew away, carrying a light smell like a memory from summer. Then they wiped their eyes, because they were good men, and anything could touch their eyes. But those times came to an end. Suitors started coming to the kitten's daughters, and he wanted to give them a big dowry. He mortgaged his mill to the black cat, who was really rich, and kept the devil's treasure chest safe in the castle's basement. And when he had married off all of his daughters, all he had left of his mill was his white coat. The black cat came with a promissory note, and the kitten could not pay his debt, so the black cat took the mill. In the night he came from the castle's basement with the treasure chest itself, which 6 devils carried with their eyes rolling. That is how heavy it was. The good men dwarfs in fear ran away through old mice and stout caves, leaving their wooden shoes on the stairs. But there was a feast in the mill that night. Devils danced with witches. In the morning the hops were burnt and hanging down. The witches had burned them with their breaths while flying away. Unloving now the mill looked. The water roared low and dark under both bridges, and all the honest people drove around them. That night the kitten slept in the hay. In the morning, after washing his mouth, he thought, where to go? Don't I have family? He straightened his haunch. Even a stone turns in the crowd when the stream carries it. I'm going to family. And the kitten went to the manor. There he had a son-in-law who was the master of the basement. He came down in the basement through the window which had grown with thistle leaves. How much milk and cream was there! The master of the basement himself was walking in a white apron, looking over the churns. The daughter also had an apron, and she helped with the work. They had a lot of work, and they were doing good. But they were so happy that they did not need anyone else. The daughter took the kitten in as a guest. She gave him cream and thistle leaves, urged him to eat, and asked how it was back home. And when he told about the black cat, how he had taken the mill, she shed a few tears about the happy place on which like green hops her childhood memories climbed. But the basement master became thoughtful and said, "He could have saved something for old age. Where will he go? He can't put his hopes on them. They have to think about children." The lady blushed and covered her face with the apron. They did not want to send beggars into the world. And then there was silence, and the kitten wondered how quickly they had talked it over. They had nothing more to say, and he knew that he had to go. He said that he wanted to visit other relatives. Now he had leisure, and now he can go for a walk. Yes, and he had free time now. Good, and you can walk through the whole town with white feet, the basement master commanded. Both became happy and early sent off the old kitten through the basement window. And while walking away, he looked back, and through the thistle leaves he could see their white happy faces. Yes, the road was dry and clean like a whitened canvas. Roadside dandelions shined like little suns, but legs were quite heavy while walking. Where to go? He raised his leg, stopped on a footbridge next to the manor and thought. Livestock was coming home from the pasture. Red Cow puffed and pushed him off the plank with her horns, and livestock would have stomped him. The herd was running to full feed bunks. Flowers and grass still hung from their mouths, but Kitten flipped over and ran off the road. There a big guard dog saw him, which was following the herd, heated, angry, with its red tongue hanging. His eyes flashed like two red hornets. They howled and dashed towards the kitten, and it barely pulled his leg out from the dog's teeth while running away. Jumping towards his side, he crouched down, and the dog, with long angry jumps, ran over him into the oats. The kitten was fleeing. Out of fear, he had not noticed that he was bleeding from the foot which had been bitten. But when he was in safety over the mountain, he could not walk any more. In torment, he dragged himself to the old brick kiln. There his daughter had married the brick inspector. On the road, next to some houses, 3 boys were playing ball. They left the ball, which had become boring to them, and fell on the kitten walking next to them. One plucked his ears and asked if he had money. The other wanted to see if he could swim, and threw him into a pond. They stood and watched how his little face slid across the other side of the pond's green water. And one kitten, long and grey like stretch from dirty water, staggered into grass. The third ran in front of him. Now he wanted to see if he can fall like a kitten can. He took him and dragged him onto the stairs up to the roof of the barn and tossed him through the window to the ground. The kitten rolled over in the air and fell in a slurry pit. The boys began to catch the new sparrows who sat on the rafter and still were single-minded and clumsy. The kitten climbed out of the pit and went in the dandelions. His white coat was destroyed, and no one could say that he was once a miller. When the lady inspector saw him walking past in the yard, she took him for a beggar and closed the door. The inspector said that between cats virtue is being lost. A day doesn't pass by when a beggar doesn't come by. He was a serious inspector, and all the neighboring cats howled and waited for weeks, licking their wounds when he went for a revision, and the kitten knocked at the door in vain. Now he thought once more where to go, but all his relatives were rich, and he had given his daughters a large dowry. Only if he had a relative as poor and miserable as him, he would have pity on him. But the rich helped the rich, and the poor kitten did not find shelter. Everyone guarded their peace and happiness, and no one took him in. And because the kitten didn't have any poor relatives, he had no choice but to wander into the vast world. The kitten walked all summer long. Dogs chased him about, cats tore at him, and boys threw sticks and stones at him. In autumn, when souls of the dead wandered in white fields like a handful of linen, the kitten, looking like he had come out of a dark farmstead of the dead, where only flat cakes from sand are given. He went from one town to the next, and was happy if there was a yard where the dog was sleeping at night, where he could rest. He was lucky if he could find a bread crust or a potato peel. That is how he had walked over half of the king's realm. When the rivers and lakes froze and grey winter clouds swept over the forest, he saw blue towers under the clouds. There was the city of the king. In the evening, the kitten went into the city. On the mountain behind the great trees stood the king's palace. The windows were dark, and the frosty trees like white corpses silently mirrored in huge dark window panes. Only in one window glowed a red stove light. The kitten sat under it on the kitchen stairs to warm his feet. "Hey, what guests do we have?" Through the door a greybird's head with white hat leaned out. It was the palace cook. "Look, a cat! Come in!" The man invited. The old cat suffocated in the ashes. "We need a new cat. Does not matter that you are weathered. Surely we'll recover. You won't have to be your own master," the cook encouraged. When the kitten timidly shifted from one foot to the other, pitifully looking into his eyes, how could such a poor kitten go into the king's castle? He did not have the clothes nor the honor, but it was the cook's affair, and the king did not send him nor clothes nor servants. The cook took him in his lap and carried him into the kitchen. Now the kitten had luck. Fairly unnoticed, he had no big honor. As the court cat, he licked milk as much as he wanted, and soon got back to his old white miller's coat. Behind the firewood he had an old carpet, in its pale colors a white house with blue shutters and a green rose bush, which with open birches reached out for the open window, was interweaved. There he sat and poured like a white mill, because he was a miller, and without milling he could not live. In the evening, when the fires burnt out in the stove, the kitten dug himself in the ashes. Only his nose was out, so he would not go out like the old cat, who had suffocated out of his coziness. Closed one eye, closed the other eye, and looked into the big stars, which trembled in the window over the great tree tops. After the supper, when the cook, maids, and the kitchen boy sat next to the red fire, with tired and red faces, he hunched over, poured, and told about his meal. Little Princess Ilzite, who was cold in the cold and dusky rooms, silently sneaked in the kitchen, sat on the footbench, and petted the kitten, and listened. And in the stowlight her round cheeks and long red curls shined. But the sick king could not stay alone for long. He sent a servant to look for her, and Ilzite had to get up from the bench, which was so nice, and go back to the old and dusky rooms in which fires weren't lit during the evenings, and there she had to sit in a high golden chair. It was sad. Since the queen had died, in the halls in which large golden lamps had stealthily mirrored in the glass halls, now weren't lit. The servants moved without noise like shadows. All over the king's castle, like a disease, sat mourning. Long ago the pine needles from the funeral had been swept from the stairs, but their scent still rolled over the king's soul, for such a time that the golden crown had begun to rust on his head from the sorrow. This bout had come after the queen's death. He had long forgotten about it, and mourned over all the suffering people and animals had to endure, over the hero in whose chest the enemy's spear rusted, over the swamp sparrow who suffered in the herd boy's noose, and even over a bug who was stoned by innocent child's foot. All the pain in the world, and the arrows always found his heart. He sat hunched in his chair, and his arms squeezing his chest. Witty court doctors advised him to sheathe his heart in gold, so it would not tremble so easily, but the king did not listen. The mourns of the miserable were dear to him, which travelled through time and distance. He kept them warm next to his heart like shivering children, which pressed against his chest with their cold hands. But did the court give in to his heart? He had already given away half his realm to all types of misfortunates, and had the pain deceased? Still, all over hang the morning like heavy drops of dew from the bright branches in the mist, which no wind could shake off. Would be better if the goods of the kingdom stay with us, reasoned the court. The world cannot be fulfilled, and they carefully protected the king from the world. Days he spent with the blinds shut, and the nights under pale twilight of the stars. Every evening the minister told him that everything was all right, and no sorrow sound touched the king's ears. But his sickness could not be healed. When life had stepped away from him, he mourned over things of old, about old tales, about fates that had left nothing more than a scent of forgotten flower leaves in an old book. He had not left more sands than waves extinguishing each other's mark. And a large book, which the king held on his knees and read to the candlelight in the evening. Was it a book like it was to everyone? It was the tarnished mountain of graves where sad saves were buried. It was a dark forest where the bones of the dead cried at night. It was a field of sorrow where every ear brought its grain of pain to God's silent corn-bin. A field in mist without end, where in the twilight corn crakes turned, and was the line of text? There were dark furrows through which ran the king's tears. The king was alone, Only the little princess was with him, and the only happiness that he had was to look into the eyes of his child, who had not yet known pain. When she was gone, he became restless and sent after her. But Ilse was cold in the sorrows of her father. She was as pale as the flower growing under the grey beards of pine trees, and often she disappeared into the kitchen to warm her soul with old people, where a big fire cracked and the kitten purred and told about his meal, and the king said to bring the kitten to him. He wanted to hear what the tale. Ilse took the miller into her lap and brought him into the hall and placed him next to the king's feet. He looked at the sickly king, squinting his eyes, laid on his paws, and began to tell how he once had a mill, how the black cat had taken them, how his daughters rejected him, and how the boys had tormented him. He mentioned all of it without anger, without hate or pain. The king listened and wondered how could pain be mentioned so easily, and tears silently rose in his eyes like blue winter joy which rises from a white garden covered in snow. Yes, yes, he had not known that pain could come and fly as easy as white snowflakes, which leaves tormented mud under them. The pain had been bitter to him, and had made his life dark and bitter, had put out the golden lamps in his halls, and even the sun in the sky had been put out. When the kitten had finished telling his story, the king took him in his lap and asked, "Tell me, what should I do to the black cat?" "Hey, king, I don't commemorate evil," the kitten answered. "And what should I do to your ungrateful daughters?" Only good, only good. When I left for the world as a beggar, there was enough pain already. Why create more? Better to create more happiness." "You are right, kitten," the king thoughtfully said. "Once I wanted to hang a plunderer, but it pained his mother, and that pain of his mother hurt his sister, and the pain of the daughter hurt her garden. The flowers withered, and the apple trees drooped their fruits unripe, because the daughter, out of her sorrow, had forgotten to water them. Then I forgave the plunderer, because I did not want to create more pain in the world." "And what should I do to the boys which tormented you so cruelly?" the king asked. "Hey, king, I do not commemorate evil. These little people are so curious. They do not know yet what pain is. They want to see pain and are happy when the kitten suffers. Life will wound their young souls, and they will know how it is to hurt. Then we will become friends." Then the king rose from his chair and commanded to light the lamps, and they one after the other began to shine forth from the green mirrors on the wall, and they one after the other began to cast bright leaves of fire into the faces of the king and the little princess. When they, like being raised by a silent wave, walked through the rooms of the castle, 1,000 fires of happiness lit up. "But you have to get your mill back. You are a miller, and I cannot think of a better trade for you," said the king about the kitten. And that is how it happened. The kitten got his mill back, the devils took the black cat with his treasure chest into the swamp, because life in the mill was not safe, and the kitten once again stood in his mill in his white coat, and once again the mills worked. Brr, purr, purr. But the king was healed, and a new life started into the castle.